All right, well, thank you for coming. And I know that there's still a little bit of a food line and people are filing in, but I thought we'd get started so we have a good amount of time for questions. My name is Jayshree Shrikantaya. I direct the Immigrants' Rights Clinic here, and I'm usually delighted for public interest lunch panels, but this is a particularly delightful public interest lunch panel because these are three former students from the Immigrants' Rights Clinic who have kindly come back to talk about their career paths and answer your questions. What I try to do is ask people to come who had a range of experiences, so working in the government, doing grant services, doing impact litigation, clerking in the federal courts, deciding not to clerk, clerking in the state court, what else am I forgetting?
Fellowships.
Clerkships, yes. Fellowships, yes. I'm doing a SCAT or an EJW. So we have a range of all of those experiences here with these three panelists. And I am definitely going to reserve some good amount of time at the end for questions. But before I do that, let me just introduce the three panelists. So all the way to my left is Alvaro Huerta. Alvaro works now to defend the rights of low-income immigrants and family members through litigation and advocacy at the National Immigration Law Center. He works, I'll let him talk about his work in a bit, but he works on behalf of low-income families to make sure that they're not wrongly denied access to quality health care. He's also done fantastic litigation on due process issues and some of the SB 1070 litigation in Arizona. Before being a staff attorney at the National Immigration Law Center, he was a SCAT and fellow there, and before that, he clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and before that, he was at the law school here. Alvaro, before law school, was working as a community organizer at CHIRLA, which is the coalition for humane immigrant rights of Los Angeles. To Alvaro's right is Michelle Parris. Michelle is an attorney with the Immigrant Defense Project, where she runs a hotline to advise immigrants and their loved ones about the immigration consequences of criminal conviction. She helps fight unjust deportations through policy work and trainings and creating resources for community members. Before she was at the Immigrant Defense Project, she was a public defender in the criminal defense practice at the Bronx Defenders for about 3.5 years. She started there as an Equal Justice Works Fellow, and before that she was here at the law school. And to my immediate left is Andrew Bruck. Andrew is Senior Counsel to the Deputy Attorney General, where he advises the Attorney General and Deputy AG on a range of policy matters, including criminal justice and immigration policy. Before joining the office of the Deputy AG, he worked as a assistant U.S. attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey, where he prosecuted violent and organized crime. Andrew clerked for the Honorable Stuart Radner, the Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court, and has also worked as a litigation associate at Davis Polk, and he lives in Washington, D.C. With his husband. So I think what I thought I would do for the structure of the panel today is start the ball rolling by asking a few questions, and then open it up to you to ask questions, and hopefully really have a good discussion about some of the experiences that our panelists have had. So one of the things that I know that students who I talk to want to hear about is what were the surprises or risks that you took in your career path, both at Stanford and afterwards? And what were things you tried that you weren't sure about but that really worked? And conversely, things that you thought you would really love but you decided it wasn't for you? So maybe if you could start by talking about that.
Sure. So, hi everybody. I guess I'll start by saying I wasn't sure I wanted to be a lawyer at all, right? I did know that so as Jayshree mentioned, I started doing organizing and community outreach work at a local immigrants' rights organization in Los Angeles. And I worked with a lot of attorneys actually from NILC, the National Immigration Law Center, where I am now, and that's what made me think, oh, law school seems cool, they're doing really good stuff, I kind of want to be them. But I wasn't sure I wanted to give up that piece that was kind of the community organizing, like the outreach piece. So I wanted to find a way of doing both. So I think kind of taking the risk of going to law school and kind of separating myself to some extent was a bit of a risk. I also didn't think I'd like litigation, and I actually do like litigation, it turns out. I'm glad that at the National Immigration Law Center we have a DC office that does more policy work and then an LA office where all our litigators are. But we are definitely integrated pretty well and do all sorts of work, both litigation and policy. So it's kind of nice to have that balance to be able to do litigation and policy, not do litigation exclusively. But litigation actually can be fun sometimes, especially on issues like immigration and civil rights work, where you know you're doing it, you know, there's a cause behind it, there are people who are affected, and NOC does primarily impact litigation, and so you know that you're going to have a kind of a systemic effect. So I think that those are kind of some of the things that I was tossing back and forth.
Okay, so I actually was a paralegal at Davis Polk before law school, and so when I started, I knew that I actually didn't want to work at a firm, and I knew that I wanted to do public interest work already when I started at Stanford, and I think as I was here, it felt in many ways very risky to be committed to the very specific narrow areas that I was interested in, and not to pursue some of the other sort of traditionally prestigious things like clerkships or some of the certain doctrinal classes that people tell you you should take. And for me, it was really important to pursue the things that I was interested in because they were leading to a specific thing for me. And so that I think felt like a risk. And I think when I was graduating, we've been talking a lot about, we graduated in a year where the economy was very difficult and we were all encouraged to do clerkships. And I just knew I didn't want to do a clerkship. I wasn't interested in research and writing as like a profession or something to do for a year. I wanted to represent individual people and I wanted to help them deal with their legal problems. And so it felt very risky to decide to close out that option. And I think for me, it was the absolute right thing. I just would never, I feel like I can't even imagine myself in a clerkship interview. Because what would I say? Like, I don't want to do this. Like, do you like research and writing? No, not really, but I need a job. Like, I couldn't even picture myself. So it was in some ways very risky, but it also felt like I couldn't even imagine myself going down another track. And so for me, that I think was the biggest risk. And, I'm currently in a job where I don't do direct services. And I think for me, that was always what animated me. And so it's been a surprising turn for me to be in a job where I don't directly represent people, but it's also a kind of a refreshing change.
I went to law school, and I didn't have a really good reason for what I was doing here. I knew that I went straight through, and I knew that I wanted to do something like in government or policy-ish, and it seemed like getting a JD was the degree that you got if you wanted to do that. And then I arrived at law school, and it turns out you have to learn civil procedure and torts and all this stuff, and I honestly hated it. Like, I probably shouldn't say this. I really didn't like my first year in law school. I was like, what am I doing here? And I can't believe I'm sinking $60,000 into something I can't articulate the purpose for it. And I remember towards the end of my 1L year, seriously thinking, like, did I actually make the right choice? Wondering whether maybe I should pull out and go do something else. And I remember talking to, I can't remember if it was Kathy Glaze or it might have been Anna or someone else, and said, I'm actually not sure that this is the right thing for me. And the advice I got was, go do a summer and see if you like the practice of law more than you like law school. And like, pick whatever you think is the most fun you could have and give it a shot. And if you don't like that, then come back and like pull out. And so I thought, everyone said it would be fun to be an AUSA, that it's like a really cool job. And I was from Jersey, so I went back and I did a summer internship at the U.S. Attorney's Office there. And I absolutely loved it. I just had so much fun. And all of a sudden, it was like getting hit by a bolt of lightning. Like, this is what I want to do with my life. And it made it easier to come back from my 2L year and 3L year, where I had a clear vision of what I was doing here, why I was here, why I was sort of taking the time to learn cases and sit with study groups and all the other stuff at law school. And that made it much easier to put up with all the various steps along the way to get there.
Great, thank you. So I know that you worked, Andrew, as an assistant U.S. attorney, and you worked as a public defender, and I think one of the things that is helpful to hear about is what is a day in the life like? So what did you do on a typical, Thursday? in the U.S. Attorney's Office as a public defender, and then Alvaro, I think, as well, sometimes a place like the National Immigration Law Center, it is confusing for people not in there to know, what do you do all day, right? I mean, is it researching? Is it answering phone calls? Is it conference calls? Like, what's a typical day? So maybe at least you start, Michelle.
Okay. So when I was a public defender, I worked in the Bronx, and a typical day, there really isn't a typical day when you're a public defender. I think, a lot of times you spend in court. You arrive there early in the morning. If you're not on arraignments, which are, the first time somebody sees a judge, then you're typically waiting for clients, meeting with clients, appearing in front of judges with clients, and then in the afternoon and evening, you spend a lot of time writing motions, having client meetings, preparing for hearings. On arraignment days, I think it's a particularly crazy kind of like public defender mode where, you go into the back, into the kind of like the jail and the courthouse, and you just meet with everybody who's going to see the judge that day. And then you go out and you stand before a judge and you ask a judge to release this person, and you talk about who this human being is that you have just met and why they deserve to be released. And so there isn't really a typical day when you're dealing with human beings who are in crisis mode and going through an insane system, but it's a lot of court and then a lot of client meetings and writing motions.
What about you?
I guess I was usually creating those crises.
Yes.
Sorry. So as an AUSA, I had usually a docket of maybe 15 to 20 cases that were at various stages in the process. Some were in a grand jury investigation, some were preparing for trial, and some was sort of post-conviction sentencing and appeal. When you're in the grand jury investigation stage, it was usually me and an agent from FBI or DEA or ATF or whatever, and we'd be working on a file. We would be coming up with an investigation plan and deciding who are we going to go after and why. We usually had some idea of who the targets were, and then we'd think about what were the investigative techniques that would get us the evidence we needed to feel comfortable charging the case. Once we felt comfortable that we could prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt, we would then indict the case or charge it. You then go through pretrial motions and eventually prepare for trial. And so usually what you're doing is, every half hour you're switching to something else in the case. You're taking a call from a defense attorney who wants to know, what's your position on bail for someone you arrested a couple days ago. You're then getting a call from an agent who needs a search warrant for a tractor trailer of drugs that's coming into the district in a couple hours. And so then you sit down and you bang something out and send it over to the judge. And so it's sort of this constant rotation of different things on a daily basis.
And sorry, just one quick note about the difference between federal court and state court, which is that they typically investigate first and, work towards getting a warrant, whereas in state court, typically they arrest your client and then people try to, the DAs try to scramble together evidence. And so it's a lot of fun for a public defender because when you get to cross-examine police officers, they have not done investigation or a lot of these proper techniques to charge your client. So it's a very different system.
So I think nonprofits are interesting. And the day-to-day is a lot of meetings and calls and following up. We do, since it's a national nonprofit, we do a lot of technical assistance to state organizations doing work kind of locally. So you do get a lot of calls on either local litigation that a lot of legal aid organizations are attempting to do, or they need analysis on like the way a law will affect, either a federal law will affect them in their state or some of their own state laws, how they're going to affect immigrants in their state. So, and then, I'm part of, different teams in the organization. So I do a lot of healthcare work, a lot of economic justice work. And I used to be in the immigration enforcement work as well. So a lot of strategizing around different cases. So like typically right now, I think I'm on 5 cases or so. And that's going to vary depending on the litigator in the organization. And it really is across the spectrum. I'm doing work on state anti-immigrant laws, family detention, identification documents, and building up also our kind of healthcare litigation and legal work as well. So it is a lot of research and writing, a lot of analyzing of either state or federal laws, kind of a lot of information production, right? Like a lot of times folks just need someone to break down the law so that they understand how it's going to work out for their client or in their state. And so we do a lot of that work on day to day.
So Andrew, I know you did a state court clerkship, which a lot of students may not be considering, and I was wondering if you could talk about what made you choose to apply to a state court judge and what the experience was like.
Sure. I had a wonderful experience clerking for the state Supreme Court. There were two reasons why I was interested. The first was I knew that I wanted to go back to my home state, and it was a nice opportunity to sort of work in an area, in a geographic location that I cared about. And the other was I liked the opportunity to work for a court of last resort, because it meant that you were always writing the precedent as opposed to necessarily applying precedent. And it meant that the jurisprudential process was more policy oriented, sort of think about like what is the right outcome as opposed to how do we apply the existing case law. And it was a wonderful experience.
Great. And what about you, Alvaro? Talk about the SCAT and EJ, the whole process, the fellowship. Both of you had that experience, and I know some of our students are interested in doing that. How was that process for you? Looking back, what were things that you did that you felt like, hey, that was the right call, and what were things that you feel like, I wish I had done it a little bit differently?
Sure, I can start. So I think one thing is I want to talk about a little bit the context of when we were in school, because I think it did affect our decisions. This is the beginning of the economic downturn. We graduated in 2010. So there was definitely some thinking about like, ooh, do you do clerkships, fellowships? Like, how do you get into public interest work? If it had been me, I would have probably jumped right into work. I thought, 3L year, why do we need this? I want to get back to work. But I had to consider, and there were recommendations like maybe you should consider clerking and kind of taking that year to figure it out. So I did apply to clerkships all over, district, appellate. I didn't do state only because I really wanted to I was thinking of staying in California, and at least the California Supreme Court didn't then take law students as clerks. But so I applied for clerkships. Also, like deciding whether to do the fellowship route or clerkship route, I was told that it'd be maybe easier to get a fellowship if you had done a clerkship before. So I did consider that. And I just kind of threw my hat in everywhere. At that point, I was like, I will go anywhere in the country. It's a year of work. Like, why not go to a random place? But I ended up in Los Angeles, my hometown. So I was like, great. Which is nice, right? I have family there. I stayed in California. I clerked for a wonderful judge, Judge Pregerson, who's finally going senior status this next month, who was a perfect judge for me because I knew I wanted to do immigrants' rights work, and he is a huge advocate of immigrants' rights. It allowed me to do a lot of the cases that I took on were specifically immigration related. So it really worked out. And the hard part was then doing the fellowship application process while you're clerking. That gets a little difficult because it is a pretty intense process, and the clerkship's obviously an intense thing, and so you're definitely juggling a lot of hats. But yeah, that's kind of the order I decided to do things in, and luckily, with a lot of luck, it worked out for me.
What about you, Michelle?
So I, was dealing with the same things that Alvaro was talking about, the decision making. But as I said earlier, I knew I didn't want to do a clerkship. So my 3L year, to go back, my 2L summer really was when I sort of started to lay the foundation. So 1L summer, I had worked at the Bronx Defenders, which is where I ended up doing my fellowship. And I really kind of cultivated that relationship over the next year and a half with people who were in management there. And I knew already, I had an idea what kind of sponsorship they wanted to do. So I kind of just built my way towards that. And then 2L summer, I asked them to sponsor me, which they did. And I spent that summer, really the last half of the summer, just calling lawyers who were in the field to kind of gather information that I could put into my fellowship application, because I proposed a project that was really focused around mental health issues, and it wasn't necessarily something that I had a lot of personal experience with, or even a lot of work experience with, other than working with clients in general. So I really had to do kind of a lot of research to make myself seem like I was prepared for this. And so then I applied for both SCAT and EJW. I went through the interview process with SCAT, and then I didn't end up getting it, and I think I found out probably right at the beginning of December, and that's when I sort of went. I went to Bronx Offenders while I was at winter break, because I'm from New York, and I freaked out. I was like, I need a job. What am I going to do? And they were like, it's going to be fine. And then I had my EJW interview, and I ended up getting the EJW. And for me, the sort of backup plan was that I would just apply to public defender offices, because their hiring was sort of after the fellowship process. And to be honest, I really just wanted to be a public defender, but I applied to these fellowship programs because it was just an additional opportunity to potentially have a job. And thankfully it worked out. And, actually being a part of the EJW fellowship was really an amazing part of my career. But my sort of backup plan was to try to apply to PD offices.
So I want to open up to questions in a second, but I wanted to ask you kind of if you could talk about one of the highlights, like one of the things that you really feel like where you made a difference, was a really interesting experience in your career. So, Alvaro, do you want to start with that?
Maybe.
Do you want to talk about SB 1070? Because I think that would be really
Sure,
interesting.
I can talk a little bit about SB 1070. So, the case that won't quit. I don't know if you all are familiar with SB 1070. It's an anti-immigrant law that was passed in Arizona back in 2010. And we've been litigating it at NILC along with co-counsel like ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, MALDEF, Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. I've been on this case for quite a number of years. Arizona was the first state to pass this kind of huge omnibus anti-immigrant state law, and then 5 other states did copycat bills, with Alabama probably taking it up 100-point notch. And when we sued Arizona, we vowed to sue any other state that did something like it. So we sued all 6 states. And over the years that I've been there, so they sued before I even got to NILC. But over the years that I've been there, we've managed to settle or win in all the other states, and have had some wins in Arizona. You all probably know that this case went up to the Supreme Court because the Department of Justice also sued Arizona, and that's the case that went up. So the kind of claims that are left over are some of the equal protection claims, some other Fourth Amendment and preemption claims that we brought. And the case has been ongoing. We're still litigating it. We're going back up to the Ninth Circuit this next month on some remaining issues. So it's been a very interesting case. It's also been interesting to be there during the life of the case, because you see kind of how a case plays out and how it can take a long time. Like I said, I wasn't in there from the very beginning, but it was kind of nice to join such a big deal case that was getting a lot of attention, and have, a lot of the cases that we do are with a lot of co-counsel. We bring in pro bono counsel, so they're pretty well-staffed cases, and so you don't always get kind of the first opportunity to do like the oral argument. Of course, your senior litigators are going to do that, but I've had a chance to do substantive like brief writing on the case, prepare moot the attorneys that are going to do the argument, and be in court. So one difference, of course, is with impact litigation, you're not in court a whole lot, right? You might have a telephonic, especially if you're not in the state that you're litigating in. So you don't get off a lot of opportunities to be in court, but when you do, it's kind of nice to see, and especially on a case like this where, because it's garnered so much attention, like the community is out there. Like every time we do go to Arizona, there are protests outside of the courtroom, and so it's been really nice to still kind of keep that connection again to the community, even though we're doing impact litigation where you don't necessarily have clients going through the offices every day.
I think this is a hard one, because I think, as a public defender, you sort of redefine victory, and so there are a lot of sort of small victories that you can describe, and then it sort of gets into war story mode, and I don't want to subject you all to that. But I will say, to this day, I will, maybe this is a little bit of revisionist history in my mind, but really one of the most glorious cases that I worked on was in clinic, and I worked on it all year with my clinic partner, Katrina Island, and it was a cancellation of removal case where the client had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and a lot of that was sort of tied in with his criminal record. And we worked and we created this insane packet that the judge was like, what is this? Like 200 pages of medical records and, testimony and all this stuff. And I think, to this day, I feel like you can never get to that level of paying attention to detail and sort of excellent material that I think you do in clinic, because in clinic you process everything. You make sure every detail is correct, you get every last document, and that's sort of what you chase when you actually become a real lawyer. and you don't have as much time, and some of the things sort of fall off. But I look back on that and I think about how thorough we were, and to me that was one of the cases that sticks with me the most.
As a prosecutor, there's a lot of really neat moments in the job where you get some big conviction or a big takedown of a criminal organization, and that's really fun. Not for you, but but there's actually a lot of much smaller moments that are much more meaningful for me and that I take much more pleasure from. And thinking about sort of the impact that Clinic had on what we do, I actually think that some of the times that have been most satisfying for me as a prosecutor is when an agent comes to me and wants to charge a case, and I'm able to say, I don't think you have the evidence for this, and we don't charge it. And that is a reaction that is informed in part by my experience in clinic, both in the Immigrant Rights Clinic and also in the Criminal Defense Clinic, which I did with Larry Marshall. Because doing those classes gave me an appreciation for what it's like when the state comes down on someone, and how important it is that we exercise that power in a careful and thoughtful way. And I'm not sure that I would have fully internalized that if I had not been representing clients on my own. And I'm really grateful for having had that opportunity working on the other side, because I think it makes me a better and more thoughtful prosecutor.
So I'm going to open it up to questions. I have lots more questions, but I want to make sure we have time for questions from all of you. Yeah.
You mentioned you had a really great time during your summer at the EJ. Can you talk just a bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I now look back on what it was like when I was an intern. It seemed like the coolest thing ever, and now I look back at what interns actually do, and it's like, it was like reviewing grand jury testimony, or creating an index for some AUSA. But what I got to do was just sort of see what life was like there, and so you tag along with a prosecutor when he goes to court, when he meets with the agents, when he's preparing a warrant for the judge, and I got just to sit down and have lunch with these people and get a sense of what is day-to-day life like, and is this something that I could see myself doing? And I realized it was. In the same way that other people will go and spend a summer working in the public defender's office, and they realize that's the community that they want to be a part of, and I got a window into that during my 10 weeks there.
Well, maybe you guys can talk a little bit about your summer experiences. What did you do? I know you were at the Bronx Defenders, Michelle, but what did you do your summers? What did you get out of it? And what should, if for those of you who are 1Ls, and I know there are a bunch of 1Ls, what are the criteria? How should you evaluate kind of what is a good summer job for your first year?
I can start for my first year. 1L year is hard, and I didn't want to do a law job. I did still do legally related job. I actually went abroad, and it's a great time to think, if you want to go abroad, go abroad. So I went to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and worked for an organization based out of the Bay Area called Migrant Rights International, that had kind of liaisons in different countries. And it was much more of a policy kind of job, but it was great because I didn't want to have to think about, all the legal stuff that we had learned the first year. It was still immigrants' rights related. I wanted to get that sense of kind of the international aspect of immigration. But it was definitely kind of like a relief. And I didn't make the decision because I wanted to, do a fellowship or, get a job with that organization. I just wanted to kind of leave and experience something different. So that was, I think, a good experience. And then 2L year, I made some money. I worked for a firm. We had a really long summer because this is the year that we switched from semester to quarters. So we had 19 weeks. So I actually got 10. It was crazy. So I did 10 weeks at a firm in Los Angeles, 6 weeks at an immigrants' rights organization in Chicago called the National Immigrant Justice Center, and then had 3 weeks to spend with family and hang out. So it was great, though, because it did get me an opportunity to work at a firm and decide I didn't want to do that kind of work. And that paid for my, my volunteer work at the National Immigrant Justice Center, which was great work. They do fantastic work. And again, it still wasn't necessarily that I was looking for the organization I was going to try to do a fellowship with. It was just an experience. I wanted to see something new.
So I worked at Bronx Offenders my 1L summer in part because I knew I wanted to do something related to criminal justice, and I found, very much my ideological home. I felt like this was the perfect fit. The holistic representation that they practice was exactly what I wanted to do. And then my 2L summer, we had the same long summer, so I worked at two places. I worked at Legal Aid Society in New York doing immigration detention work, so representing people who were detained there. There was only one lawyer at the time. It's now expanded significantly. And then the second half of my summer, I went and worked at the New Orleans Public Defender Office. And so I knew that, at that time, I had done Bronx Offenders, I had done clinic, and so I kind of wanted to sort of keep exploring but not commit, I guess. So I was sort of doing, they were all related. The seed was the same seed about the criminal justice system and how messed up it was and toxic and awful. And so, they were all related in many ways. But I took that summer to kind of make new relationships and explore geographically and kind of open up my options, which was great.
Well, one of the things that, I think we don't talk about as much in law school that I think it would be great for you to talk a little bit about is, what these experiences like clerkship or these first jobs are like as students of color, as a gay man. Like, what is it like to go into an experience where, you're not part of the majority in a certain way? And you bring a different life perspective. How was that, and what, do you have thoughts that you can share? I'll let you decide who goes first. Do you want to start, Michelle?
No, not really. I think honestly, as a lawyer of color, it's just something that is always going to exist in the world that we live in the public interest world. Clerkships, it's sort of like, it's a world that is dominated and led, honestly, by white people. And so as a lawyer of color, you're always trying to work your way up, you're always trying to work your way in, and especially doing direct services work, doing public defender work, a lot of your clients are people of color. And so, I think you have all these experiences even as an intern, where you'll be sitting with a white lawyer and the way that they're talking to their client, it's like, what? You're sort of shocked by it. And I think, it only sort of reinforces to you the importance of you being there, but it doesn't necessarily make you feel comfortable. And so I think there are always going to be experiences where you're sort of uncomfortable. And, thankfully I've been in environments where, the sort of communities of people of color are quite strong and everybody is very supportive of each other. But I do think, being a student in that environment is very hard because you're there to sort of observe and not to lead at that point. So you do kind of it does expose you to the challenges of being a lawyer in that environment. And I think it's very complicated when you're representing people of color and you're in an office that doesn't reflect the diversity of the people that are being represented. And I think it's important then for you to be in that place and to have that voice amongst the people in the office and to try to, push for change. In terms of the other, I think for me, the Bronx Offenders in part why it was also home was because I'm from New York. The population there in terms of the ethnic background of clients was similar to my own. And so for me, it felt very comfortable. And I know that when I went, for example, to New Orleans, it's like there are people who are people of color, but we have very different cultural backgrounds and understandings and communities. And I found that to be actually very surprising to me, how sort of the lack of connection in that sense, the barrier that it created. And so, I think every situation was just a new and interesting dynamic, but I don't know that I had anything that was particular to being a student.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Michelle said, and I think the only thing I'll add is that we do have opportunities, I think, because we're talking about public interest organizations. People are well-intentioned, if nothing else. And so, you do get, it is important to find the right fit to some extent. I was glad that when I started at NILC, they had just started with the Racial Justice Initiative, a kind of project, kind of both to look at it internally, what are the dynamics inside the organization, but also how do we incorporate racial justice into our work as well? How do we make connections with other organizations especially when you're dealing with immigration, right? Everybody thinks it's a Latino issue, and so how do you make those, you branch out to obviously other communities and be intentional about it? And so you do have to find kind of the organizations and people in those organizations that are interested in pushing that, and you do have to push it a little yourself too. If you're interested in it, if that's something that you care about, you do have to commit to kind of pushing your colleagues and inserting that voice, because it can get lost. As well-intentioned as people are, sometimes they're thinking through a certain lens and aren't looking at through the lens of either their client or the community that they're working with. And so it is important. I think that's why it is important to have people who are coming from the community or organized in that community or did work in that community to go out and go back to those communities.
So my husband and I had this neat experience a couple of years ago. So my husband is also a lawyer or a recovering lawyer. He clerked on the 10th Circuit, and I clerked on the New Jersey Supreme Court. And we got married in June of 2013, which was, we got married about 2 weeks before the decision in Windsor came down. And in the year after, and both of our judges were at the wedding, both the judges we clerked for. And in the year after the wedding, both the 10th Circuit, where he had clerked, and the New Jersey Supreme Court ruled on gay marriage. And it was our respective judges who had authored the opinions. Judge Lucero, who authored the opinion in Kitchen in the 10th Circuit, and my judge on the New Jersey Supreme Court. And I would not be so presumptuous to say that our presence had an impact on how they ruled. I think they're good, thoughtful people who came to what I think is the right answer on this question. But I would like to think that when they were authoring the opinions, that in their mind was the wedding that they had attended 6 months earlier, and that at least shaped the way that they viewed the question. And that's a long way of saying that it doesn't there's a value just in being there. That just being around and having people work with someone who's gay or African American or Hispanic is a value in and of itself to help sensitize the rest of the world to the fact that you're also a human being who also is deserving of rights.
And sorry, one small addition on the student end is that, I think it's really important to find mentors of color, and also if you work in an organization, go find the people of color and speak to them, because they'll probably tell you the truth about what's actually going on in the organization. Obviously be smart about how you do that, but I think, if it's important to you how the environment is, and obviously you can look at the structure of the organization and see, are Black people moving up, are Latino people, whatever it is, that you're concerned with. But I think if you talk to people, they will often tell you the truth about what's actually going on under the surface.
I wanted to pause for a second. Yeah, question. Go ahead.
So, immigration work, the perception, or at least my perception, whether or not it's sure as I that it's fairly geographically limited. There's a lot of work in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York. But some of us are from between the two coasts and have sort of like this ideal of taking some of our advocacy home. What routes do you all see? Have you all seen mechanisms for getting outside of these hubs on these issues, taking advocacy kind of in a more impactful way than just sort of being one guy yelling in Columbia, Missouri? What more have you seen people do to take their kind of systemic advocacy to the Midwest or to places that aren't New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Miami?
Alvaro, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Yeah, I mean, it's true that those are kind of the hubs of where the work is happening. But I think the exciting thing is a lot of the, both good and bad, is that a lot of the bad things are happening in places where we need more people, and so there are opportunities there. And and a lot of our work, of course, is like foundations, and they want to put people or resources where it's needed. Often, so there are great organizations in the South. So Southern Poverty Law Center does a lot of immigration work. I did the second summer at the National Immigrant Justice Center out of Chicago, Illinois. So there's definitely work in the Midwest. There are a lot of smaller organizations. You're right. You might be one of 2 or 3 attorneys at an organization. But the good thing is that I think the immigrants' rights community has definitely grown up a lot since at least I was involved before law school. And the networks are pretty well established now. And so we work consistently with people all over the country doing technical assistance or getting them connected to other people doing similar work in other places. Now there's a regional organizations of coalitions of immigrants' rights organizations. So I think, except for maybe the Dakotas, there's places, and I'm sure there's somebody there too. But there's ways to plug in, and I think you do have to. It does put a little bit more kind of pressure on the person to kind of reach out to these other hubs, but there's ways of connecting.
And I think that, one important thing just in doing that type of work is really just talking to as many people as you can. And in part, I would look to organizations that have done something similar. For example, like say, take Florence Project, where you're in a sort of geographically isolated environment, but they've managed to build a really robust organization and try to figure out how they did that. Because all of those things take a lot of time and sort of building and building and building. So for example, Padilla, where people receive immigration advice when they go through the criminal justice system, that's something that, was years in the making, and now is still in places that are outside of these big hubs. There aren't resources, and people aren't getting that advice. So it's sort of like you can start at a defender organization and try to push it that way, or you can build up an immigrants' rights organization in a particular way. You can look to see if there are people who are like local politicians who are interested in this issue and who are willing to put money into sort of, a lawyer working with community organizers. And I think you just need to talk to as many people as possible in other sort of isolated areas that are outside of the hubs to figure out how they've built up their sort of capacity.
Yeah, I think this is mostly for Michelle. You mentioned that you came to law school really focused on what you wanted to do, and I'm just curious if there are any other opportunities or activities outside of clinical work that you took advantage of that you felt like really supplemented that focus that are different from the traditional things that people else do.
So, I think other than clinic, the most impactful thing was my 1L LRW professor was Jeannie Marino, and she was doing housing work in East Palo Alto when I started. And I think she sort of like picked me out as one of those law school haters. And so she's like, this girl needs help. And so she encouraged me to apply for this Equal Justice America scholarship to go work in East Palo Alto for the semester. And I did it. And, it was really what got me through 1L year in many ways. But I think any opportunity to kind of like Andrew said, practice the law is important. And I think it adds to your resume, it adds to your ability to expose yourself to different type of work that you may or may not like. So I think, taking those sort of volunteer opportunities are important. I didn't do one of the like spring break trips. I don't know if any of you guys did things like that. I found that a longer period of time, like a semester, of sustained work with a community was really important. But that's like the main thing that I did. And I think, taking some of the sort of practice-oriented classes like evidence or trial ad are important if you want to particularly be like a direct services lawyer or be practicing in court. Having those practical elements are really important.
Yeah. This question is also from Michelle, actually. I can relate to the not feeling like you want to clerk mentality. Can you talk a little bit more about if it was a really hard decision to not clerk, like how much of an obstacle it is for somebody who wants to go into the public interest without clerking, and then explain a little bit more what you meant about if you hadn't gotten a fellowship, what that route is for applying to jobs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, I'm not gonna lie, it was very difficult to decide to not apply for a clerkship. I knew that personally I couldn't do it, but that doesn't mean I wasn't having 4 meltdowns a day, as everybody else had jobs and I didn't. I think at that point I had done a lot of research preparing my fellowship proposal, and I had, a distinct plan for if not this, then this, if not this, and this is who I'm going to beg. And then, I had planned it all out in many ways and talked to a lot of people. So, for me, it was about making sure that that foundation was there of relationships, sorry, of relationships. And I'm sorry, you had another question. The clerkship, how.
Well, yeah, I guess.
Yeah, sorry. So there are a lot of people who apply for fellowships who haven't done clerkships. The thing about doing a clerkship is that basically, I think my understanding is for fellowships, like say you have another job and then you apply for a fellowship, I don't think you can get a fellowship, but if you've done a clerkship, then you can get a fellowship afterwards. So it kind of is like a gap year where you can keep your option open to do a fellowship. And obviously many people think clerkships are prestigious, and so it adds to your resume in a way that fellowship organizations like, but it's definitely not necessary. And I would say a lot of the fellows who started with me did not do clerkships. And most of the people were straight out of law school. So I would say you shouldn't worry about that if you're interested in a fellowship. You should just worry about finding a sponsor and getting a good project and feeling connected to that project and feeling like you can really sell that project. And public defender organizations so the fellowship process, as you may know, starts like basically right when you start school and you apply, and then people kind of find out over the fall and into the winter about what happens. EJW is a little bit later. They can tend to interview even into the spring. But public defender organizations, they don't really do their hiring until kind of like the end of winter, I think is when people do interviews, at least back in the day. So I knew that I could have a sense I knew whether or not I would get SCAT in before the public defender process really got going. So if I didn't get SCAT in, then I could kind of start applying to other public defender organizations. It just so happened that their timing was different. And I think you guys are in a very, very, very different landscape than we were. Like the job universe is just very different. It was just very dire when we were applying, and I don't think it's the same now, at least as a practicing lawyer and seeing all these organizations that are around that are hiring. It's a very different time and place.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm having a hard time figuring out what to say. So, but it's basically, I'm really interested in criminal defense, but I think it applies to immigration work as well, in terms of detention of like an adversarial system and how you work with the other party across the aisle. Like I'm sure, like from a prosecutorial and defense perspective, that you all have very different views on maybe some things. But it seems to me like that in that field, it can often be pretty polarizing, like which side you're on. So I'm wondering like how you navigate that in your work, like how important you find it to build relationships across the aisle, and what that looks like, especially when you're advocating for individuals against what are often like prejudiced systems.
You probably have a lot to say about this, but I'll just start by saying this. I mentioned we do a lot of family detention work, and along the border, right? A lot of our detention facilities are, Arizona, Tucson kind of area, and we have this long-standing injunction in place, Orantes, that we use to get into family detention facilities, and you deal with the DOJ attorney, who is, the attorney on the case. And then we recently used that same injunction to get into another facility, kind of without telling them that our real purpose was to file a new lawsuit. And we got that same attorney. So you do want to write the same attorney that we were dealing with before I got this new case, and I'm sure was like not happy that we had used the other case to get in. But so you do have to like keep those relationships, kind of be fair. I think that the thing is like you just want to be able to know that like you're dealing with good people who are obviously you have your clients, they have theirs, especially when you're dealing with the government. I think they have an even higher burden of being fair, but you do want to maintain that relationship because you are going to see them again. You're going to see them in like almost every case that you bring when you're dealing with the government and DOJ. It's a little different when you're talking about criminal issues.
Yeah, I mean, I guess on a specific work level, as opposed to like, I don't know if you're asking in part because you're contemplating trying out different sides of criminal defense work or prosecution work. I don't know if that's the case. I mean, I know at least in the state public defender community, and I would say probably similarly in the federal defender community, it's very difficult to enter into that community if you've done prosecutorial work. I don't know that it's the same on the prosecutor side. I think it's actually an asset, I guess, maybe, that you've done defender work. So in that sense, like the communities are very polarized in that like defenders are quite closed off to that. The reality is that in order to get your clients deals that they want, if everybody hates you, you can't do that. And, you know, sometimes you have to like smile in a prosecutor's face just to get whatever you need. And then, you know, you turn around and you're like, I hate you, you know, like, but I think, you know.
And I was going to say about this great relationship with public defenders.
I think, you know, to me, everybody has an individual relationship as a defender with prosecutors, right? There are people who, your job is really to go down in flames with your client, like to do whatever you can to get whatever you need for your client, obviously within the bounds of like ethics and professionalism and all that. And so there are some people who just wouldn't care at all what prosecutors think, and they burned a lot of bridges, and then it, you know, caused problems for their other clients. On the other side, there are people who were just super friendly with DAs, and, you know, they felt like, oh, this is great, I'm helping my clients because I'm getting deals. And to me, you know, that's a very difficult relationship, because as nice as I think a DA is, right, and as good of a deal as they give my client today, they're going to try to screw my client tomorrow, and then I'm going to hate them. So I know, like, I know that my feelings for them are never going to be all good, just based on my role in the system and who I'm fighting for. So I think, you know, obviously you want to be professional in the sense that you don't want to screw future clients. But I think you have to keep a healthy distance in order to remind yourself, like, what you are there for, at least.
Yeah, I mean, look, I actually think that I had decent relationships with the public defenders I worked with, and it is totally possible. Right, exactly. All this, they're sitting back in Jersey right now, you know, sharpening their knives. I think that, look, this is also, you can sort of generalize this more broadly. Like, the legal community is very small. You'll see this, like, as soon as you get out into the world. Like, it is so tiny, it will boggle your mind. And it is always in your interest to treat people with decency and honesty and respect. And when you do that, you can operate in an adversarial system and still work well and get done what you need to get done. And I don't think there's anyone who would argue against that. But there's a certain level of professionalism that I think that as long as you adhere to that, you can work across the aisle with people against whom you sometimes have very serious differences.
Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in how to balance the desire to work on the systemic policy issues that I'd be interested in, and also have a lot of interaction with individual clients and feel like you're really fighting for a person. And if you have any thoughts on how to incorporate both of those things into a career, whether it's at the same time or your career develops at the time of it.
I mean, I think all three of you have done both of those things, and I think, Alvaro, you're probably the one who's doing both at the same time right now. So maybe, can you start off and then maybe...
Sure. So I think, yeah, that's always been kind of the tension, right? I've always wanted to have that direct kind of interaction with the community and also do kind of impact work. The good thing is that, like, some organizations like NILC, you know, we aren't a coalition ourselves, but we work with a lot of organizations that have that direct impact, and that's where we get our cases, right? Like, it's the people who are dealing with folks directly are saying, this is a problem, we're seeing this happen over and over again, and they bring that to our attention, and then we can kind of kick it up a notch to the impact level. But we've been trying to, and it's a struggle, but we've been trying to do kind of this community lawyering kind of example of, like, making sure that the cases are being led by the people, the plaintiff. So we involve them quite a bit on the strategy and, like, keep them informed about the next steps. And, you know, on the Arizona 1070 case, like, we kind of had a big loss recently, and our clients were like, we are not going to accept it as a loss, so you guys need to appeal. And so we appealed. You know, even though we were like, we're not sure this is going to get us any further, but that's kind of what we've seen as our role, is that our clients really are leading the cases. And so it's you know, again, we don't have that client coming in every day, you know, kind of the direct services model, but you do get a chance working with community organizations and organizers to have that kind of the client influence, at least, to do systemic change. And I think it's not the only way of doing it. I think there are people who do direct services for a couple years, then move up to impact, or the reverse. I've seen the reverse of people doing impact work and then saying, no, I'd rather do the direct services work. Or just even the individual practitioner, immigration practitioner, who is particularly enthusiastic about, like, the civil rights or kind of bigger issues, and will jump in, right? They have clients, they have their own practice, and will engage with us and bring other issues to our attention.
I think finding an organization where you can do a mix of both and where it's possible to do that kind of practice is kind of like a unicorn. It's a very difficult thing to balance, I think. And I think, particularly having come from a public defender office, a direct services environment where lawyers are so harried and it's like you can barely remember your clients' names and cases. You're able to pick out the problems in the system, but you just don't have the capacity to do that level of big picture thinking until you're sort of removed from it a little bit. And so for me, I did direct services. That was what I always wanted to do. And now I've sort of shifted towards, bigger picture work. And it all relates back to what I was doing. And so I found that to be very rewarding. But I think it would have been very difficult in the direct services environment to be able to kind of balance both things. And I do, even now, when I'm incredibly busy, I'm like, you have to put so much thought into this advocacy work, and you really have to let it marinate. And so I think it's very hard when you're doing direct services, but I think those options are very open for you to kind of go back and forth, between direct services and bigger picture work. I think it's just hard to do it both at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. So I was working as an AUSA, and now I'm down in DC doing policy work at Maine Justice. And the one pitch that I would make is there's a really good argument for folks doing the ground level work first before they do the policy making, because it is right. So in my current job now, one of the issues that's really hot is criminal justice reform, and it is so helpful when you're thinking about criminal justice reform to know what it's like to investigate a drug case, what it's like to see people who get sentenced for these unbelievably long sentences, and to know the impacts it has on the community and the impact it has on all the people participating in the system. And that influences the way you think about how to approach the issue, and also what should the legislation look like, and what are the policy trade-offs, and you can't do that unless I think you really know what it's like on the ground. So if you're gonna try to do both, I would say start down and move up.
And I should just say, in the clinic, the Immigrants' Rights Clinic, one of the things you can do is be exposed to both things to see what you like. I'm not sure I agree with that it's a unicorn as much as I think there's a range. So I feel like there are organizations that have all direct services, with like a public defender office, and there are organizations that just do the impact work, and then there's kind of like a range between those two. And I think part of it is where you feel like you want to be in that range. Because I think maybe there's a different way of saying that it's a unicorn. There's not a perfect marriage place. It's that it's, at different points it's integrated in different ways. I think we have time for one last question. Okay, then I think we'll wrap up. I just wanted to thank, which I forgot to do in the beginning, Salsa and the Levin Center for co-sponsoring, which is wonderful, and Katie for dealing with the food and organizing, which was really fantastic. I think our speakers are here for a little while if you want to come up and talk to them about their career paths and get more advice. And thank you for coming.